It's unnerving when you have to wait for the buzzer. And I didn't plan for the failure of that as part of my talk, I promise. I'm very happy to be the first speaker today because you won't be able to compare me with anyone. And by the time you hear everybody else, you will have forgotten what I've said. So I'm going to talk to you all about failure, a very particular journey, a professional failure, what I felt was terrible in my life, and how it impacted on me, and obviously those closest to me, and in particular, my husband and my children. And I also think it's really important to remind everybody that failure is normal, that failure is part of our lives, and that the scars that we get from failure are parts of our learning and our processes. And in a world, especially when our young people, but even they're not so young, are constantly fed social media where everything is wonderful, where everything is beautiful, I think it is important to give us all a dose of reality. So this is what I wanted to tell you, and I want to start with the journey and how it began for me. So I want to take you back to 2017, to July in particular. It was a very momentous time for me. I'd left partnership after 16 years of hard work in one of the largest law firms in Gibraltar. I had a very good practice, and I left an organization of 200 people to go into a new startup with just 7. In fact, I was allotted tax code 007. I don't know whether it was a premonition of the metaphorical bombs I would have to deactivate, but so be it. So I went into a new company called Addison Global, which then became known as Moplay. It was an online gaming operation, and later on it was known for its debacle and liquidation. But I'll tell you all about that a bit later. I was so bloody excited. I was essentially going from a major career change. So it wasn't just a new job for me. I was a lawyer by practice, and I was then changing my role completely and becoming the chief strategy officer and the director of a business. So it was very scary, but at the time I felt like I was the cat that got the cream. But even before I go into the journey of Moplay, I need to tell you a little bit about me and my growing up years, and give you a little insight to me as a child and my relationship with failure. One of my mentors at work told me once that I was an overachiever. You would think that was a compliment, but he didn't mean it like that. He always told me that I was always focused on what I was still missing, rather than being happy about the goal that I'd achieved. As a child, I was described as many things: energetic, bossy, independent, sporty. Ultimately, I was not used to failing. I was very determined to always do what I needed to do. I had good grades, except for music. I was really bad at music. I was very sporty. I was a particularly good runner. And I was in a well-known dance group when I was growing up. I was head girl of West Side. I was the first in my family to go to university. I never wanted to let my parents down. But it was all my aspirations, never my parents. So I knew how to navigate challenges and the dips and troughs that comes from a journey. But when I suffered a very big one, which is what happened to me with Moplay, I suffered tremendously. And I experienced such anguish that I could not sometimes face the day. So I was very depressed after that. But now I take you back to the beginning of Moplay. So when I joined, I knew there were risks. A lawyer is trained to see the risks, and we're trained to mitigate the exposure to that risk. When we see clients, we advise them on their contracts, what can go wrong, the litigation strategy, the governance processes, the policies, how to get things right. So I knew more than most the risk that I was taking. But I always think that even if you minimize risk, you cannot move forward if you don't take the risks. And I had a fantastic opportunity, and it's an opportunity that doesn't come very often in Gibraltar. So Moplay was an incredible experience. And now that I can look back, I know it was more than a journey that ended in failure. In a journey, there are many highs and lows, and many more. And in Moplay, on balance, there were many more wins than losses. The business existed for just under 3 years, But in that time, I learned more than I had in the previous 6 to 7 years in my previous job. It was a very intense time for the good and the bad. And when it was good, it was very, very good. We went from 7 employees to 170 people in a year and a half. We launched the business in just under a year. Can you still hear me? Yes. Yeah. Well, hopefully they'll fix it once I continue talking. We launched our business in just under a year. Can you? And now, perfect. So we launched our business in just under a year with the start of the Premier League and our announcement of our partnership with Manchester United. We had licenses in the UK, Ireland, and Gibraltar. And we concluded a deal with one of the largest Mexican media partners to run their Mexican licensed operation. In fact, just for comparison, the only other partner of that Mexican partner was Bet365. And here was this little startup who had managed to negotiate a deal with them. We were the first Gibraltar online gaming business to form part of the All-In Diversity project. It was spearheaded by me, because I feel very strongly about a diverse workforce. And I don't mean just about gender, but all other spectrums, including people who come from every different background, culture, neurodiversity, everything. In addition to Manchester United, we signed partnerships with Watford FC, with a football club called Hertha Berlin, and also with Atlas Football Club in Mexico. And I was very much instrumental, an instrumental part of that deal. We even had Dr. Eva Carneiro as our first motivational speaker. And it's a pity that we can't hear her today, but I hope that for all of us, we will be able to have a chance to hear her in future. So I look back at those first 2 years, and it was undoubtedly the best job I ever had. And I'm now grateful to have had the chance to have lived through that experience, because some people never experienced that in their lifetime. But we failed. And why did we fail? Startups fail for a multitude of reasons. US data on startups, the US is renowned for being the jurisdiction which has the most startups. They say that the most common reason businesses fail is because they misread the market demand. The second most common reason is because of lack of fund raising or lack of funding in general. Suffice to say that it was the second reason that happened to us. Our shareholders stopped funding us for many reasons. But he kept promising he would do so that we would keep the business going. So for 9 months, we worked in the most toxic and stressful environment. Thankfully not with our colleagues. If there's one thing we did right, was hire the best people. It takes so much of your focus and your willpower to face angry suppliers demanding payment over growing debts. The CEO, the CFO, and I spent hours on Thursdays and Friday evenings making calls to negotiate extensions on our repayments, many times unsuccessfully. The end of the month was absolutely the pits for me. About a week before the end of the month, I would scrounge around for funds to pay staff, literally begging and sometimes screaming to our US shareholders team to get us money to pay staff. There is nothing more important to me, not just about the contractual obligation to pay staff, but the moral obligation to pay staff. And there were times when the CEO and I did not pay ourselves to ensure there was enough for others. The environment annihilates your morale. You sometimes feel like your sense of worth is nothing. And you can imagine, over a consistent period of time of working like this, the state I was in and the rest of the exec team by the time we resigned. I watch and read the news a lot, and I know that there are a lot of businesses teetering on the brink. So I'm sorry that a lot of people are feeling the same sort of pressure, and all I am going to say is that they need to wait for that break in the clouds. The rain stops one day. But in my head, I was not ready to fail. So when the rest of the world was very unhappy to be put into lockdown, I welcomed this. I didn't want to speak to anybody. I didn't want to see anyone. I existed with a sense of dread and worry. People in our team had no jobs, and we didn't know it then. But when COVID hit, which was only a couple of weeks later, there was a hiring freeze everywhere. Lots of people didn't have a job for months, and that killed me. In liquidations, the proverbial has hit the fan. People have lost their jobs, and other very powerful people are owed a lot of money. So people, even if you haven't done anything wrong, they distance themselves from you. There were a number of calls and actions from people that have been seared into my mind. I will not forget the good, but I will also not forget those who dropped me. It was very painful. But you become harder and stronger. There were others who were absolutely amazing. And I apologize if there's a younger audience here, but I've got to say the quote he gave me. My Israeli friend said to me, "Chin up, Nyreen. You don't know shit about business if you haven't failed at least once." There is a reason why outside the US, Israel is where the largest number of startups come from. So during the last 9 months of Addison, I lived up to my strategy titled Tenfold. It was a game of cat and mouse with our suppliers, with the teammates, just to keep it all real so that they wouldn't realize how bad things really were. Professional advisors, our shareholder, I navigated through the minefields being in a position of responsibility in a business that was teetering on insolvency. It was the most challenging period of Moplay and the one which I learned the most. But in my new role, I know that this is the learning that I bring, because when things get tough in new businesses, that's when I can help. Because when I was emotional with Moplay, I'm no longer emotional when I'm advising now. So I know I can bring much more value. So analyzing the failure. Why do some failures in life cause us more anxiety than others? The reality is that I haven't, like I'm sure you haven't, gone through life without failing at some stage. Those of us who are willing to try new things have experienced these failures, even from the day we start to walk. It is one of the reasons why I also encourage my own children to do sport. I always find that sport is a great way to learn perseverance, resilience, and getting better through the process. I recently heard a podcast by Elizabeth Day, which is called How to Fail. I recommend it to you. She did an interview of the actor Stanley Tucci. For those of you who don't know, Stanley Tucci is not only just a great actor and an acclaimed director, he's a consummate cook and has published cookbooks, and if that wasn't enough, he survived cancer. And in his interview, he describes one of his biggest failures as being unable to swim. And who would objectively regard Stanley Tucci as somebody who's a failure? And it resonated with me, because I can't swim. And I realized, it dawned on me, that the reason why he felt that was a failure was because he accepted it as a failure, but it didn't define him. And it is only after we accept a failure can we move on. So why did I feel like such a disaster when Moplay went insolvent? And after all, I mean, the failure of Moplay wasn't just my failure, it was a collective failure. And I realized at that point that something akin to this depression that I had at that point, I'd only ever experienced once in my life, and it was when I had my first child. I'd planned typical me, I'd planned absolutely everything in relation to the pregnancy. But I ended up in an emergency C-section. And I felt from the get-go that I'd failed him. And you would think, what's the similarity? But the similarity with that and the experience of Moplay was that I'd failed in a position of responsibility. I felt like I'd failed my son because I ended up in a C-section, however silly that may sound. I felt like a failure in Moplay because I felt like I'd let down 150 people. I'd never been very good at separating personal and professional, and I never do things by half measures. I always want to do very well in whatever I do. But someone told me, Nyreen, you're responsible to people, but you're not responsible for people. And it's filtered now. I understand what that person meant when she told me this. And everyone will have their own reasons in their life for feeling like a failure at some stage. But ultimately, we are never going to move on unless we accept that failure. I don't ever want to experience that gut-wrenching feeling anymore. But if I have to try something new, then so be it. I think I'm in a far better position now to deal with it now. So it has taken me nearly 2 years to get here and feel this way about the value of me. 2 years is a long time to deal with negativity. There is a quote I read a few months ago which stuck with me. See? I'm nearly finished, I promise. There's a quote that stuck with me. I want me back. I haven't felt like me in a while. Those of you who know me, and for those of you who don't, I love to run. I haven't run for about 7 months. I've had a lumbar disc herniation. This is the first time I'm wearing heels in a very long time. And this physical ailment and a couple of other horrible things that happened last year made me snap into action. And I said to myself, I want to be me again. So I'm working on my version 2.0. So I'd like to close with a quote from J.K. Rowling. Failure is so important. We speak about success all the time. It's the ability to resist failure or use failure that often leads to greater success. I've met people who don't want to try for fear of failing. I have never been one of those people who lived in fear, and I hope neither are any of you. So go and fail, and go and succeed again. But please try, and don't be fearful of failure. Thank you.